Hey, it's time for Storytime with Sabrina. Today we're reading Seedah, about a girl from Laos. A girl in Laos. Seedah meets Yesu in Puan. Seedah's brown eyes apprehensively searched the rainforest as she cautiously made her way down the familiar dirt path. Along the path to her auntie's house, unnamed fears lurked in the verdant undergrowth. Vague shadows of childhood memories haunted her mind, causing a growing uneasiness to overtake her whenever she passed this way. A forgotten old wound ached under her right shoulder blade. Suddenly she heard the crashing of brush, which got louder and closer, along with snarling and hissing, until finally out of the trees burst an orange and black tiger and a red-scaled dragon tangled up in lethal combat. Seedah could feel her heart racing in fear as she stopped breathing and slipped into the shadows, hoping to remain unnoticed. Once behind a nearby tree, she silently let her air out, took a quiet breath, and peeked around the tree to see what the oversized animals were doing. Having stopped in the clearing, they were still growling, hissing, clawing, and biting, intent on killing each other. How would she ever get past them? She dared not risk attracting attention, so they blocked her access to the path that could take her home or to her auntie's. And what would happen if one or the other was victorious? Would it stay on to feed on the other's flesh, keeping her trapped in the forest indefinitely? Seedah closed her eyes. Her heart still raced, and terrible memories returned to her conscious mind. There she was, a little child, running and screaming. As terror filled her mind, the tiger caught her little shoulder between his terrible, huge teeth. Shooting pain invaded her whole shoulder. Suddenly the tiger roared in rage, letting her drop limply to the ground. He reared up and turned on her father, who had stabbed the tiger from behind with his jungle machete in order to save her. The rest of the fight was blurred by her tears, the terror, and a horrible feeling of helplessness. A sudden loud roar just on the other side of her tree jolted her back into the present. If only there was someone who could help her now. She dared not look to see what was happening, but stood frozen, listening. The hissing of the dragon and the growling of the tiger resumed, along with other sounds of struggle as the fight moved away from her again. Oh, that was close. How long would this go on? She felt a little faint. Slowly she became aware of a growing light behind a tree nearby. In spite of the very present peril that raged so close by, she began to feel curious. Where could the light be coming from? What could be producing such an unusual light here in the shadows of the rainforest? The light continued to become brighter and bigger. Quietly, a man stepped from behind the tree. Looking behind him, he beckoned to someone and pointed to the clearing where the scuffling was becoming less noisy. Seedah peeked around her tree again and saw that the tiger and the dragon were both looking at the light, even while still tangled up in each other's claws and teeth. She looked back at the light and saw huge men coming from behind the tree, one after another, following the first man. The men were 7 and 8 feet tall, and carried huge swords in shields that hung from their belts. Their bronze skin and white tunics emanated the strange light she had seen, and their loose pants seemed to be made of fire. As the first man pointed to the tiger and the dragon again, Seedah saw for the first time the bleeding scars on his hands. The tall men headed out into the clearing, drawing their swords as they went. To Seedah's amazement, the swords appeared to be made of fire. The dragon and the tiger took one look at the men and their flaming swords before scrambling to be free of each other and fleeing in terror off into the forest on the other side of the clearing. The tall men disappeared into the forest after them. With her hand on her chest to still her beating heart, Seedah let out her breath in relief. The man with the bleeding hands looked at her and smiled. Again Seedah felt curiosity welling up within her. Who was this man? Who were the men he had sent after the dragon and tiger? Why had he sent them? She took a step towards the man, then didn't know what to say. In spite of herself, she reached out her hand to him. The man understood and came towards her. He stood in front of her and took her hands in his. "Seedah," he said, "I have come to heal your old wound." "Okay," she said, wondering how he knew her name and how he knew about the wound, but feeling rather speechless in his presence. He reached his freshly scarred hand around to touch her under her right shoulder blade. She felt his blood on her wound. She closed her eyes as the sights and sounds of that terrible day washed over her mind, but somehow it was all different now. He was here with her. She was not alone. Then his memory flooded into her mind, the man's memory of how he had gotten the scars on his hands. She saw his great love for her, how he wanted to help her and her people, and to rescue them from the constant fear and danger that they lived with every day. Tears came to her eyes, tears of relief and gratefulness. She opened her eyes and looked into his. Gently he raised his hand to wipe away her tears. "Who are you?" she finally found the courage to ask. "My name is Yesu," he said simply. Then he turned to walk away. "Will I see you again?" she called after him. Looking back over his shoulder, he smiled. "Yes," he replied. A few days later, Seedah sat with her chin on her knees on a large gray rock, overlooking the lush green valley below. It was one of her favorite places to be alone and think. On this day, the memory of the man with the bleeding hands absorbed her thoughts. Such a powerful man he was, commanding those huge warriors, yet gentle and caring, able to heal her deepest wounds. As she thought about him, she felt his love for her, and a reciprocating love welling up within her heart. "Seedah," a low, gentle voice behind her spoke her name. Turning to look over her shoulder, she saw Yesu walking towards her. His brown eyes, full of life, love, and desire, earnestly looked into her eyes and into her soul. He smiled. Sitting down on the rock next to her, he too gazed at the green valley before them. "Long ago your people knew my father and his wisdom and protection. Unfortunately, as they traveled to this place where they now live, they lost touch with my father. They made covenants with demons instead. That is why they now live in fear and torment," Yesu explained. "You mean like my brother, who felt afraid when his bedroom door kept opening and shutting when no one was there, and my mother said it's only Grandma's ghost? Like when my brother woke in the night and someone he couldn't see was choking him, and the more he struggled, the tighter it got? Like my uncle, who stepped into the spirit world to find a little girl's spirit, even though he knew the dangers, and though he found her, as he ran back across the threshold into the physical world, the big black one who was pursuing him ran a sword through his back so the tip came out the front of his shoulder, and he died," Seedah remembered sadly. "Yes, just like those times, and many more like them that your people have experienced," Yesu replied. "I have come to let your people know that I paid the price to buy them back from the covenants they made with the demons. I have come to offer your people freedom and deliverance, a new life of authority and power over those who now oppress them. If they will break their covenant with the demons and come back to my Father, they will be able to share in the power that I have over the evil spirits." "How is that possible?" Seedah asked curiously. "I allowed myself to be killed by them to satisfy the blood requirement for releasing your people from the covenant. But you can see that I am not a ghost, that I have a solid body just like yours. This is because my Father used his power to raise me up again to life so that I could live forever, to help your people come back to him and enjoy what I have won for you. Our good spirit, Puan, is able to be with each and every one of you at all times. When he comes to you, you get the power I have won for you," Yesu continued. "He will teach you everything you need to know, and he will give you wisdom about what will happen so you will be ready for the future." "I'd like that," Seedah said simply. "Next time I will bring Puan with me and introduce you," Yesu said, rising. "Until then, think of me." He smiled at her and strode briskly back into the green rainforest like a man on a mission. Slowly rising and stretching, Seedah headed for the trail, back to her home. So much to think about. Her mind reeled at the thought of freedom at last from the spirits that had held her people in bondage and had tormented them so much of the time for centuries. As she walked down the mud trail, she absent-mindedly ripped a banana off a bunch that grew within easy reach on a nearby tree. Eating and thinking, she made her way to the ladder made of sticks that went up into her woven bamboo and grass-roofed home. Up the ladder she stepped, onto the open porch with the wooden handrails that surrounded her home, and from there in through the open doorway. "Are you in good health, Mother?" Seedah greeted the older lady respectfully as she stirred the fire in the fire pan, preparing to start supper. "Yes, good health," her mother replied. "Where have you been?" "Just up the trail, looking over the valley," Seedah replied. She had told no one of her encounters with Yesu as of yet. She just didn't know what to say. Stepping outside with a bowl in her hand, she poured off the water that the rice had been soaking in, while leaning the bowl a bit on the handrail of the porch. Back in the house, she dumped the rice into the basket, which she then set in the pan of water on the fire, where the rice would steam as the water boiled. Her mother was busy preparing a spicy beef dish that would be served on a bed of lettuce. Seedah went out to the lean-to check on the chickens and feed them. When she came back in, her mother was putting food up on the small one-board shelf jutting out about a foot from the top of the wall that served as a sort of shrine for her deceased father. It had always puzzled Seedah how someone who had loved his family so much in life could turn so cranky towards them after death, but that is what seemed to happen to everyone. Her father had died defending her, but now he complained to his family in their dreams, demanding more food, and his ghost wandered around the house at night, making their hair stand on end. Along with the rest of her people, Seedah dreaded the full moon because the ghosts of their deceased loved ones were more active on that night. After supper, Seedah lay on her bed mat on the bamboo floor, thinking about what Yesu had said to her earlier that day, until she drifted off into a peaceful sleep. She dreamed of Yesu and the big warriors, and of what it would be like to live free from fear and free from the evil spirits. Kneeling by a rock by the river, Seedah was busy washing the family clothes. She dipped each garment in the water until it was wet, then applied a kind of homemade soap to it, scrubbing it on the rock and on itself, then rinsed it by dipping it in the river again as the water ran by, and wringing it out. When all the wet clothes were clean and back in the basket, she picked it up and set it on her hip to leave. However, she quickly set it back down again because she caught a glimpse of someone coming through the trees and thought it was Yesu. She was right. As he came around the last tree, she saw that he had someone with him, but she couldn't see him very well because he was rather translucent. Other than being translucent, he looked a lot like Yesu, with his brown eyes and dark brown, loose-flowing, shoulder-length hair, and 5'9" muscular yet wiry build. Seedah. Yesu's voice was becoming familiar to her, and she loved the warm feeling inside that she got when he said her name. "This is Puen, the one I told you about. I have to go back to my father's and work on the city I'm building for you and those of your people who will want to come back to my father. Puen will speak for me and tell you about me, and he will tell you all that you need to know to prepare for the time when I come back to get you. I don't know how long I will be gone, but Puen is your direct line to me. He will immediately pass on anything you want to say to me as well." Puen smiled and nodded to Seedah. She had the feeling that he knew her every bit as well as Yesu did. In fact, it was almost like they were the same person. Yesu continued, Would you like Puen to stay with you always?" "I would like that very much," Seedah replied, thinking that it would be rather like having Yesu with her all the time. Yesu looked pleased with her answer. Then he put his hand on her shoulder and looked into her eyes. "I will be thinking of you," he said, "and I will be with you through Puen. I will always be with you." Then he turned and walked away. "Well, shall we?" Puen said, looking at her basket of laundry. Seedah smiled. "We shall," she said, picking up the basket, leaning it on her hip, then transferring it to the top of her head for easier carrying on the dirt trail that led to her house. She wondered how life would be different with Puen around. She thought it would be pleasant, even if nothing else changed, just to have him there with her because she could feel Yesu's love for her through Puen's presence. It made everything seem suddenly brighter in the rainforest around her. On arriving at Seedah's house, Puen followed her to the clothesline under the house where she hung up the wet clothes to dry. A couple of her friends walked by and greeted her, and one stopped to talk for a few minutes. But no one asked her about Puen. She was beginning to think they couldn't see him. She wondered if her mother would notice him in the house. After hanging up the clothes, Seedah went up the ladder to the house and went in to make the rice for supper. Greeting her mother, she soon saw that her mother didn't see Puen either, which was fine because she didn't know how she would explain that he would be staying with her anyway. That night, as she lay on her bed mat, Puen lying next to her on the floor, she looked up at the shrine shelf, and her thoughts wandered to her deceased father and the ghost that she and her family served now out of respect for the man their father had been. She heard Puen's voice in her head, and she looked over at him to find that he was indeed communicating with her silently. He had heard her thoughts and was answering them. "It is good to honor your father. He was a good man because he imitated Yesu's example, even though he had never met him as you have. He loved you and gave his life for you, just as Yesu loves you and gave his life for you. He listened to his conscience, which is the law that Yesu's Father has written on everyone's heart. But this ghost you serve is not your father. It is an impostor. Did you not think it strange that your father's nature changed so much when he passed over from this life into the next? Your father has not changed. Then where is my father, and why did this impostor spirit come to us? Can we be rid of the impostor's tormenting? Seedah questioned Puan in her thoughts. Impostors come to your people because the covenant your people made with the demons long ago opened the door for these kinds of things to come to torment you. You must break the covenant and come back under the protection of Yesu's Father. As you become more and more one with Yesu, you will experience more and more power over his enemies. The demons are his enemies, you know. They desire to oppress your people, but Yesu wants you to have abundant life. Yesu loves your people more than life itself, and to see you tormented, afraid, and experiencing losses of all kinds in your service to demons and in the power they are able to hold over you because of the ancient covenant, it causes him great sadness. He weeps with your people as they suffer. His compassion, the word means to feel with, caused him to take action and give his life blood to free you from the terrible mistake your ancestors made so long ago. This gave Seedah much to think about, and she was getting sleepy, so she forgot about the question about her father's whereabouts and drifted off to sleep while trying to wrap her mind around the new concept that the ghost was not her father and that they might be free from the ghost's demands. The next morning she awoke to see Puan still there with her, watching her through half-closed eyes with a little smile on his face. She felt so happy that her life had changed in this way. She knew she had much to learn, so very much to learn yet, and she was glad that Yesu had sent Puan to be with her always and teach her all the things she needed to know. There was plenty of time for learning. While making their way to the garden that morning, Seedah asked Puan, "So, who exactly is this father of Yesu's?" "He is the one who created the whole world and the skies beyond," Puan replied. "He made the animals and the people. The first people he made, a man and a woman, foolishly turned their backs on him and his words of wisdom, bringing death and many harsh things into the world. This is why Yesu's father had to make a plan with Yesu that would undo all the evil that the old dragon had tricked the people into allowing to come into the world." "The old dragon?" Seedah queried curiously. "The first dragon, the ancient dragon," Puan explained. "This dragon has fought against the father's purposes almost from the very beginning. He deceived the first woman, telling her that the father was holding out on her, that listening to him was causing her to miss out on great things. Little did she know, because as yet she had no concept of such things, that the things she was missing out on by obeying the father were actually things like death, sickness, regret, torment, fear, and pain. Because of the plan that Yesu and his father came up with, though, Yesu is making a place for you where these things will once again be non-existent." "But won't the dragon come there and deceive the people again someday after they've forgotten about the evil things?" Seedah asked. "No, there will be a great battle, and Yesu and his warriors will throw the dragon, along with his helpers, into a fire pit from which they will never again be able to escape," Puan told her. "This is how Yesu will rid the world of evil and suffering forever." There was silence between them for a while as Seedah pondered all Puan had said while she tested the pineapples by pulling a green leaf out of the top of each one. She found a few ripe ones to put in her basket. Examining the chili pepper plants, she found a batch of ripe ones there as well. Taking out her machete, she chopped a few stalks of sugar cane to take home with her as well. With everything but the sugar cane securely in the basket, she balanced the sugar cane across the basket and lifted it to her hip. They were ready to head for home. On the way home, a large tiger walked out of the forest onto the path ahead of her. She froze as it looked at her. "Yesu, where are you now?" she whispered. "Help me." Puan stepped out ahead of her and signaled into the forest off to their right. Immediately, 3 of the huge warriors she had seen before stepped out from between the trees. On spotting them, the tiger's hair stood on end, and he turned and raced off back the way he had come. The warriors stood looking on for a moment, as if they could see through all those trees where the tiger was running to. Then they melted back into the rainforest. Feeling great relief, Seedah set her basket down and sat by the path to recover her breath and stop her trembling. "Thank you," she exhaled to Puan. Puan looked at her. "Don't thank me," he said. "It was Yesu." Then Seedah remembered her whispered prayer and how Yesu had told her that Puan would relay her messages to him. Resting her head on her knees, she breathed her gratefulness to Yesu, knowing that Puan would pass it on.